talk a little college football playoff. John, I know you and Dave were speaking about whether or not a 2-loss SEC team should get in over a 1-loss Penn State or Indiana team based on their resumes. Well, as you guys were talking about that, and Dave told me you guys were talking about that, it came out that Eli Drinkwitz of Missouri, obviously the Missouri head coach, says that 10-2 SEC teams should get automatic bids, period, end of story. Said that yesterday. Now, we know why Eli Drinkwitz is saying that, because Missouri is going to be the most fraudulent 10-2 team in the history of 10-2 teams in the SEC this year, because they have played a garbage schedule. But my question is, does he have a point against an Indiana or Penn State, neither of whom have beaten anybody worth their salt this year?
Yes.
Yeah, he has a point. But strength of schedule isn't the only factor in it. And that's a valid point, because he has, his schedule. But when I watch Indiana, if Indiana and Missouri were playing this week, I'd make Indiana about a 12 to 14 point favorite.
Indiana?
It's a better team than Missouri, and it would be more competitive in the playoffs than Missouri did. Remember, Missouri got blown. That's another sidebar to the schedule issue. And that was a really, really bad loss. So what part of that game? It was never close.
Sorry, you cut out. Which was a bad loss?
The A&M game. I mean, A&M just hammered Missouri.
Oh, yeah, they did.
So, I mean, if that had been a close game, Eli would have had a much better point. The thing when I look at Indiana and Penn State, and they both factor into this SEC debate as to whether the SEC could get 5 teams in, Penn State, the brand is a factor there. If I look at Indiana's body of work and Penn State's, and I watch the teams play, I like Indiana better than I do Penn State. And at least you don't know what Indiana will do against Ohio State. You might think you do, but you don't know. We saw Penn State against Ohio State. Penn State did what it always does against Ohio State. I trust Indiana's quarterback more than I do Penn State's. I just think when I look at Penn State, nobody seems to question Penn State, which has 1 loss. What's its best win?
No, I agree. And let's talk about that for a second. I think the SEC is perhaps down in that they don't have an elite team, but in some ways they're up, because I think 1 through 8, maybe even deeper than that, is really, really good. So I think every year has to be taken at different face value. And I'll tell you this, I think that a 10-2 SEC team, face value, and we can expect their records, their big wins, their tough losses, and all that, should get in above an 11-1 Big Ten team that half of the teams they play aren't any good. So aside from Oregon, I would say that a 10-2 SEC team should get in above an 11-1 Penn State or Indiana team. Am I crazy, John, to say that?
Well, I think you are in Missouri's case.
Well, okay.
Missouri's got an inflated record. We know that. I mean, when you watch them play, that they eked out a win over Vanderbilt. I watched them against Boston College. It's just kind of a little bit of better than mediocre team. So, but you're right. But everybody else, when you look at a 10-2 team in the SEC, I could see that in the committee. The committee likes the SEC. I thought, going into the season, I thought 5 SEC teams would make the playoff. I thought there'd be 3 from the Big Ten and 5 from the SEC. Then I changed my mind after Southern Cal beat LSU, Notre Dame beat Texas A&M. But now I'm kind of going back to what I thought in preseason. I think the SEC has a good shot at getting 5 teams in. It will depend on how some games play out. You'll have to avoid upsets, because when you start looking at those schedules, Yeah, I thought Southern Cal was going to be a factor in the Big Ten. It's no factor at all. But I think, yeah, it depends on the schedule. When you look at Georgia, if Georgia, even here's another possible scenario. Let's just assume there's some upsets. A 9-3 Georgia against a 10-2 Big Ten team. I would take Georgia.
Yep, I wouldn't have an argument with that. Hound Dogs of Knoxville champions look good in orange. HDKnoxville.com. HDKnoxville.com. Caleb?
All right, well, John, let me throw this scenario out at you, because we're ragging on Missouri, and I agree almost the rest of the SEC that if they go 10-2 should get in over an 11-1 Penn State or Indiana. Sidebar, I do want to point out Penn State has beaten at least 4 teams with winning records, 3 Power 5. Indiana's beaten 1. So their resume is a lot better. But what if Texas A&M at the end of the season beats Texas handily at home? At that point, don't we have to? I know you think Texas has the best roster in the SEC, but based on resume, Texas has played a god-awful schedule too. I mean, it's on Indiana's and Penn State's level and Missouri's level here, what we're talking about. So if Texas doesn't beat Texas A&M and they go 10-2, shouldn't we throw them in the same boat as Missouri at that point, based on resume?
No, I wouldn't do that, because part of this, it's also the eye test. I mean, I can watch Texas and tell it's a lot better than Missouri. If they played, Texas would win that game by 2 touchdowns or more. So you got to factor that into it. But I do agree, Texas, let's forget about Missouri. We've dismissed them from the conversation. Look at Texas. A 2-loss Texas team would be the most vulnerable of these other SEC playoff contenders, I think, because what's its best win?
Vanderbilt. That's its best win.
Yeah. And then early in the year, it was kind of a big deal that it went into Michigan and won handily, but now we've seen what Michigan can do. Although Michigan did play Indiana close. But
John, let me ask you this, not to interrupt, but if you were on the college football playoff committee and you had to make your final vote today, and they said, listen, here's how we've laid it out. These are the parameters. You get no comparison. You get no leeway. But what 4 teams, because they're only taking 4, and Mr. Adams, give us your 4 SEC teams that are in based off what you've seen to this point. And then a double question, poor journalism on my part. What do you think it will be at the end of the year?
Well, I think if you can only take 4 teams, I would probably take Ole Miss, Alabama, Tennessee.
That's hot.
Gosh, I'd have to take Georgia because it beat Texas in Austin pretty convincingly. I know Texas made a lot of mistakes, but yeah, that would probably be Tennessee's. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kay.
I was going to say, so hypothetically, like, is this assuming Texas loses to Texas A&M at the end of the year and they're all 10-2? Because that's how this would have to work out.
Well, that was
I'm talking about right now.
Yeah.
I'm talking about right now.
Oh, right now. Okay.
So the second part of that question is, who do you think, if it were just 4 teams, that it will be? If everything goes chalk, which I guess would be Tennessee losing to Georgia, even though I've already picked Tennessee to win that game.
Yeah, if it goes, I mean, but see, I think Tennessee's going to beat Georgia, so that factors into it. So I think it would be Texas, Tennessee, Alabama, and Ole Miss.
That's
A&M would be knocked out. I still think Texas is going to beat Texas A&M, and in preseason, I had A&M making the playoff, but I like Texas a little more.